Um, with tensions, in Syria, and Israel's excursions into Syria, hitting targets, what they claim for whatever reason, and the Palestinian treatment, their treatment of Palestinians.
Yes.
How do you see Russo-Israeli relations going? Is it a détente? Is it more of a actual permanent relationship? How do you see it?
U.S.
No, Russo-Israeli relations.
Russo.
Yeah.
Well, the relationship is actually a pretty good one. And Putin and Netanyahu seem to like each other a lot. I've met Mr. Netanyahu. I've interviewed him 3 times. He's a clever man, clever politician. And he knows exactly what he wants. Today, the relationship is one of mutual interest. There are over 1 million former Soviet and Russian citizens living in Israel who have a great impact on that country. Netanyahu said to me, if it were not for them, we would still be an agrarian, backward society. It's because of the Russians who came, technology, science, and all of that, that we've become what we've become. A lot of the politicians, the leading politicians in Israel are former Soviets. So the relationship with Russia is a very interesting one. On the one hand, it's people who left Russia. They didn't want to leave Russia. They wanted to leave Russia because of anti-Semitism, especially in Soviet times. Today, and I say this with knowledge, there is no anti-Semitism practiced by any kind of government or anything in this country. Sure, there are anti-Semites. Well, where are there not anti-Semites, right? But it's a completely different situation. Maybe you'll have the opportunity to look into that, the way Jews have the possibility to create their clubs, their organizations, their schools, and so on in Russia. It's quite amazing what's happened. And without any kind of unpleasantness about it. So the former Soviets and Russians living in Israel know about this. They come back very often. They visit. So there are these ties between the two countries that are actually very strong because of that relationship. And there's a kind of there's some mutual political interests between Putin and Netanyahu. To say that this is a permanent thing, I don't think in politics anything is permanent, except the interests of those who run the country. They're permanent. But I would say that by and large, the Russo-Israeli relationship is a pretty solid one. In many respects, trade, economy, exchanges, education, and so on. Sir?
It wasn't just bipolar, you also had a significant non-aligned movement, and the UN was allowed to do some good stuff. Since the end of the Cold War, we had a very short unipolar situation. That has now gone, I think. International law has been grossly violated, particularly by NATO and the US, but also by others. The UN itself is being pushed to one side, is allowed to do virtually nothing. A tiny fraction of money has been spent on promoting international peace versus the military-industrial complex. The amounts involved are huge. So, is there a better way, and how do we get to that better way?
You know, if I had the answers to all those questions, I probably would be, I wouldn't be a journalist. These are extremely complex issues. The only way I can answer that is to say the following. There are certain things that I want. I want to achieve better understanding. I think that's crucial. I want to overcome bias, fear. And I think that if I can do that, it's a major step in the right direction. I don't want to solve the world's problems, because I can't. Say, for instance, there are little things I can do, like I don't buy plastic. I just don't, because I think that what's happening with the environment is terrible. So I, for myself, I say no, I don't buy plastic. there are little things that each of us can do instead of, saying, I'm going to solve, you're not. So through my work, as I'm talking to you, for instance, I try to create understanding. Not say, oh, wow, Russia is great. It's not. It's got huge problems. There are things I really detest about what's going on in Russia. I don't like Putin at all. If I could, I'd elect someone else. Problem is, I don't know who. And that's a big problem. And that's also because of him, because he's pretty much wiped out the opposition, see? But nonetheless, there's a question of understanding. It's not emotional. It's about, climbing up the other guy's belfry and looking at the world from his view. And it's a different view from yours. So I think each of us can look at some very concrete things. How am I going to change the United Nations? I'm not. I'm not even going to try. But I do think that if, as a result of what I'm trying to do, there will be different people in the United Nations, then it'll be a different organization. So, that's the way I look at it. Now, I've been around for a while. I'm 85. So, I've come to certain conclusions. Basically, life is tragic. Well, because we all die, right? I mean, funny or not. And it's something we, human beings, can't really accept. I mean, was I born to then one day die? So, religion is about that and so on. But on the other hand, I think that we're magnificent. We do things that are incredible. We create things of unbelievable beauty. And we can be noble and courageous and loving and all of that. So there's a lot of very positive stuff. And I look more at that and I say to myself, okay, here's what I'm going to try to do. And it's not heroic, and you don't walk around waving a banner. You just do it, and in your own capacity, in your own job.
Putin, for example, in a recent Financial Times interview, emphasized the decline of Western values, Western economic order, and in many ways cultural values.
Right.
And he gives in to gender issues and things like that. And also, Putin has displayed piety by attending Orthodox services.
Yes.
So what is the connection there? What's the role of the Orthodox Church in politics, and how sincere is Putin in promoting his ideas?
Well, as you know, the Russian Orthodox Church is the result of a schism that occurred back in the 4th or 3rd centuries in the Christian Church, and split into the Eastern, Byzantium, and Catholic. And the prince of what was then ancient Rus, which is Ukraine actually, Vladimir, who was then a pagan society, opted for Christianity. He was actually courted by different religions, Muslim, but he opted for Christianity and for Orthodox Christianity, which I think was a tragedy, something I've said publicly, for which I've been castigated and called anti-Russian and God knows what, because I think that the Russian Orthodox Church is one of the most reactionary, one of the worst possible organizations. Now, I'm an atheist, and I know that most people in America kind of shudder when they hear that word. I was on the Donahue show many years ago. This was 1987, I guess, in New York. And one of the ladies in the audience said, asked me, Mr. Pozner, do you believe in God? And I said, no, I'm an atheist. And there were about 200 people in the studio, and they all went, like I said, that I eat children for breakfast. I mean, basically that was it. And then after the show, another lady walked up to me, and she said, Mr. Pozner, when you're in America, you should never say that you're an atheist. You should say, what's the people who don't know? You should say that you're, yes, and they'll think it's a religion, and that's fine. So anyway, the Russian Orthodox Church was probably one of the main factors that led to Russia finally liberating itself from the Tatar yoke back in the 13th century. You know that for 300 years, Russia was under the Mongols, much like Spain was under the Moors for 800 years, 300 years. That impacted and changed the mentality of Russians very profoundly. 300 years is a long, long time. That's another story. So the church was very instrumental in doing that. But the church, at that point, wanted power, political power. So there was a constant tension between the Tsar and the church. And it was Ivan the Terrible, the Fourth, who ultimately broke the church's back by murdering the patriarch, which is pretty much par for the course kind of thing that he did. And that's when the church became secondary, but a very big influence, very big influence. And in the Russian Empire, you could not be called Russian if you were not Orthodox. So it was a state religion. To this day, now that the church has come back, to this day, people will say, "Ya pravoslavny," I'm Orthodox, which basically means I'm Russian. During the Soviet period, the church, of course, was suppressed, but then during the war, when the Nazis were advancing, Stalin brought the church back as a unifying factor, as something that would bring Russians together against this enemy. And to a certain degree, that's what Putin has done. He's brought the church back because there's nothing that unifies people anymore. There's not a common ideology. There's not a common belief. What holds us together? In America, at least you can say, well, you know, we have the Declaration of Independence, and we have our great Constitution, and we have you know, certain basic things that aren't really that much in existence anymore, sadly, but nonetheless very important for the American outlook. And what do Russians have? Well, we had something we believed in, something our parents sacrificed their lives for, and it turned out to be a pipe dream. So what do we believe in? There's nothing. Well, at least you can believe in this. And so I think Putin has made a real effort to show that, yes, here's something that we can all share. Whether or not he's actually religious, I have my doubts. Maybe. But the Russian Orthodox Church is a factor that is anti-democratic, anti-liberal in the good sense of the word. Liberalism is suddenly, well, not suddenly, but for a while now it's become nearly some kind of a dirty word, all right? So, you know, homophobic, anti-abortion, anti-Western, as I said, anti-democratic. It's anti. Women should be subject to their husbands. It's the whole 9 yards of what the church originally was. Is it powerful? Yes and no. About 5% of those who say that they're Orthodox actually attend church. But on the other hand, they say that they're Orthodox. So, you know, it's a little bit hazy, but it's very much there. We've got time. Let me see. I'm going to go back and forth, okay?
Because we are at this threshold, and you said it so perfectly with the essence of, are we about protecting who's on top? Because that's a mentality we're still living with. Or survival. Survival is smacking us in the face. And I love what you said about the 10,000 exchange students. So how do we pay more attention to the potential of what could be emerging right now among the youth, looking at the youth movements around the world, and just looking at other potentialities, things that are emerging but not, that need more attention from media and just in public conversation?
I don't know. I really don't. I think that there are ideas that catch fire. Who knows why? But suddenly, so it's the right idea said at the right time in the right place, and it hits. And you've got to have the idea. Now, the idea that I've had, this exchange thing, I've had it for a long time. And I've repeated it time and time again. And it hasn't caught fire. It's a complicated thing to do. Because you have the parents who may not want their children to go away for a year. It's not easy. It's a really serious thing. On the other hand, it's a major kind of thing. And I keep hoping that one day, someone with a lot of power and influence will think that it's a good idea. So I just keep repeating it, you know. But, you know, I have no recipes. This isn't how you cook a duck, right? This is much more difficult. So I can only share with you some of the things that I know, some of the things that I've seen, some of my thoughts. But when you ask me, how do we do this? I don't know. I'm not prepared to answer that. Everyone, I think we all make our own decisions as to how we go about doing something. Listening to others, liking an idea, disliking it. So, you know, don't ask me, how do we do this? That's for you to figure out. The fact that you've come here is in itself an expression of what you want to do. And it's a very important one. You're giving up your time, you've spent your money on going to this country that you really don't know all that much about. You could have, I don't know, sat home, read the paper, smoked a nice cigar if you do, you know, enjoyed yourselves. But you felt that you should do this. You know, there was a wonderful writer by the name of Jorge Semprún, a Spaniard, who fought during the Spanish Civil War, and then went to France. And then during the occupation, he became a member of the underground and fought the Germans. And finally, he was caught. He was a big name, and they put him in the Gestapo solitary confinement. Then he was sent off to one of the camps, I think it was Buchenwald, but he survived. And when he came out, a few years later, several years later, he wrote a book in French, because French was his second language. It's called Le Long Voyage, The Long Trip. And he tells his story, and he tells, among other things, this fact that he's sitting in solitary confinement in a Gestapo prison, and the soldier who's guarding him asks him, says, "Why are you here? What have you done?" And he says, "Well, I'm here because I'm a free man." And the soldier says, "What do you mean you're a free man? You're in jail. Now, I'm a free man. I'm going to go back to the barracks and then go have a beer and, you know, what do you mean?" And Semprún says, "You don't understand. When you invaded this country, I didn't have to fight you. I could have sat at home, enjoyed my wine, read my newspaper, enjoyed my woman, and lived a normal life. I didn't have to risk my life. But as a free man, I had no choice. As a free man, because everything you bring is against freedom. So if I were not to fight you, I would have forfeited my freedom. And I'm here because I'm a free man." And I thought, what a great way of putting it. You know? You're told to shoot me. You're told to go back to your barracks. You're not a free man. And I am, and I'm in jail. And I think each of us, you know, when we make a decision, like the one you made, which is not that dramatic, but still, it's a decision. It's about a feeling that I have to do something. And that in itself, in my opinion, is tremendously important. Sir.
You are very even-handed in your comments earlier about U.S. and Russia relations. I go down a list in recent years of different situations: Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea, Turkey, Iran, and to me, the actions of Russia are responsive and in fact very reasonable. I've listened to many hours of interviews with Sergei Lavrov, with President Putin, in interviews, formal presentations, and I'm at a loss for the stupidity. You mentioned the stupidity on both sides. I'm frankly at a loss for the stupidity on the part of Russia, because I just don't see it. I see actions as being reasonable. So what do you see as, I'm not looking for a bashing or anything, but what have been the problems? What do you criticize about it, in specifically foreign policy?
About Russian foreign policy?
Yeah, if anything.
These are not simple things to analyze. But I feel that if you're going to call for something, then you should set the example. For instance, if I smoke, I can't tell my kids not to smoke. Because they're going to say, well, you know, if I say it's bad for your health, they're going to say, well, why do you smoke, right? So if Russia says, everyone should keep out of the internal affairs of other countries, so should Russia. It doesn't. If you look at the Syrian issue, I understand what was going on there. The Americans came in first, but the Russians went in as well. Now, the answer would be, if we hadn't banned blah, 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 well, yes, but you did go in. The story with Abkhazia, which used to be part of Georgia, it's a complicated one. I would have tried to solve it in a different way. I would have done my absolute best to solve it politically. I think it could be done. But I think that on the Russian side, as a result of the way Russia's been treated, there's a desire to show muscle, to show, you know, we can do this. It's almost like the invasion of Afghanistan back in 1979, when, as you may recall, there was a big fight going on as to whether or not the United States was going to deploy medium-range missiles in Europe. The Soviet Union was tremendously against and tried to organize all kinds of worldwide international demonstrations and so on, led to nothing, and the Americans deployed the missiles. And as far as I know, the Soviet leadership, way up on top, said, finally, the ones that were the most anti-Western, see, you can't deal with these people. The only thing they understand is strength. Now, let's look at Afghanistan. And so that was the answer, which was a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. A catastrophe. Not just because they couldn't win that war, but psychologically. Soviets had always been used to, fighting the good war. Fighting the good war. And here they were invading a country that had not attacked them. And this really affected the outlook of a lot of people. The army, that used to be everyone's hero, suddenly became something very different. So, anyway, again, I think that there are, in foreign policy, there are things that I don't agree with. Take those, the islands out there that the Japanese say are theirs and the Russians say are ours, that became part of Russia as a result of the war. I know that most people wouldn't agree with me, but I would say, look, there are 4 islands, okay? Let's do 2 and 2. Now, there would be a huge outcry on the part of Russians saying, we're giving up part of our territory, that's not patriotic. There would be a huge outcry on the part of Japanese saying, why are we only getting 2 instead of 4? But basically, I think that that approach is the way you solve international issues, not saying no. Okay, I'm going to ask people who have not asked questions are going to get first dibs, right? Yes.
The deal that Putin offered to the oligarchs, all but one of whom took the deal.
Yeah.
What went through, can you tell us what was Putin's calculus? In other words, why did he offer them that deal? What did he see the alternative to making such an offer to be? What would have been the consequences of that? And what if they had not taken the deal?
Well, if they'd not taken it, they would have been in big trouble because a lot of their money was made illegally. You know, I think it was Balzac who said, the first million is always criminal. Now, these people had billions, so, you know. They would have gone to jail legally. It wasn't like, the things would have been brought up. And I think what Putin felt was that they had undue influence on what was going on. That they should not, that money should not be the factor that energizes or moves the country.
Why not just tell them, give up the money, we're going to prosecute you? Why did he not choose?
Well, let's begin with why did they have the money? They had the money because everything was privatized. Why was it privatized? Drastically and dramatically. Because the people who were changing the country, Gaidar, among them, one of the leading ones, felt that the only way to make sure that the communists don't come back is to privatize everything. Not allow the government to own it the way it used to be, the state, but privatized, but quickly. Well, how do you privatize quickly? Well, you sell it off for nothing, and you sell it to your friends. Yeah? Otherwise, it's going to take too long. Amazing things happen. Just imagine all the apartments that were owned by individuals. They weren't owned. They belonged to the state. People paid rent for them, but it wasn't their property. They couldn't buy it or sell it. In one day, all apartments were privatized. The entire country. Can you imagine how many million square feet of living space were suddenly privatized? There's never been such a change of wealth in such a short time in the history of mankind. This was done with a purpose. See to it that the system does not come back. So now if Putin had said, all right, we're going to take away your money, where would that lead? Where would that lead? Where was that going in that mentality? Are we going back to socialism the way it was in Russia? And it wasn't even socialism, seriously speaking. What he wanted was that these people who had gotten their money, they'd never worked for it. See, the difference between the American billionaires, well, take Rockefeller, probably the richest man in the world when you consider today's money and so on. He worked for his money. Sure, he killed Indians, sure, but these are Ford. These are people who worked for it. These guys didn't work. I knew so-and-so. He'd say, well, look, there's a couple of mines out there. You got like a couple of thousand rubles. Bingo. So the attitude towards these people, again, was a very different one. They don't deserve it. Why have they gotten? I created it with my labor. I worked to make this society, to create this industry, and suddenly, a guy by the name of Khodorkovsky gets oil. Why? Well, because he knows a guy by the name of Gaidar, and Gaidar knows a guy by the name of so on and so on. So, Putin had to be very careful. He just said to them, stay out of politics. Stay out, and I understand that. Because as it was, people were incensed at these wealthy people. And then seeing them run the country was creating a really, really hostile environment. So I think those are the reasons. Okay, sir?
So years ago, I read an article in Rolling Stone magazine.
Who?
Rolling Stone magazine, about 20 plus years ago. And it was talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall and what was the reason behind it. It kind of simplified things And now looking back, it's very simple and things are much more complex than the reasons they gave. But what impact do you feel American culture at that time ended the Soviet Union, brought down the Berlin Wall? And do you think that American culture has the influence that it once did now?
Interesting question. To my mind, there's no doubt that the 20th century was an American century. When you think about how many things have come from America, it's really amazing. Beginning with all kinds of clothing, things like baseball caps, blue jeans, t-shirts, polo shirts, sneakers. I mean, just go on. And the entire, and this apply, you know, and then music, jazz, rock, and all of that, it all came initially from the United States.
Pointed to MTV.
Yeah, and no, so it had a huge influence. What's more, in the Soviet Union, they tried to block it. So, all broadcasts in Russia, from the Voice of America, or from the BBC in Russian, or from the Deutsche Welle in Russian, they were blocked. The Russian government spent billions of rubles trying to block it, but nonetheless, according to figures that I have, about 40 million people were able to listen regularly. Because since it was prohibited, it was of great interest. Instead of having the intelligence to say, yeah, listen, it's all right, you listen, you don't listen, but when you're told you can't, immediately, well, why can't I? What is there that I'm missing here, you know? So American influence was very strong. Less strong now, much less strong now. And America's lost, for instance, take cars. The American car used to be the symbol, beginning with Ford, and then going on to the 50s with the tail fins and the this and the that. And now nobody wants American cars because people realize that Japanese cars, German cars, some Italian cars are actually much better, Korean cars. To a great degree, America has lost its charm, which is very much there. And it still is. I mean, for Russians, America, and for most of the world, America still remains a unique country and attractive to many. But the power that the 1950s and 1960s, I think, were the apex of all of that. And since then, it's gradually leveled and then started to go down. I think we're going into the Chinese century, and I'm not happy about that at all. It's not going to be a lot of fun, believe me. But I'm not going to be around, so I really... yeah, it is too bad. But I guess that's the way it always happens. You know, there was a French century, there was the Brits, once upon a time, were the world's example. And, you know, that's the way it goes.
Is Russia ready for democracy? What do you think?
From 2000 to 2004, and then from 2004 to 2008, and then pretty much selected Mr. Medvedev to be president for 4 years until 2012. Then he came back. They changed the constitution to 6 years instead of 4. So 2012 to 2018, and now 2018 to 2024. That means that the man has been will have been president, if he doesn't die, for 24 years. And most people of that, let's say, with a university education and more or less are against that. They say that, well, they pretty much share the view that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. People would like to see a democratic change. Now, sometimes you get, as a result of democratic change, sometimes you get a Trump. But, you know, as Churchill said, democracy is very messy, It's terrible, but it's the best thing that we've yet had. So it's pretty much. So you know, I can't say what will happen, but I do think that one man's being in power for that long is dangerous. And although now in other countries, like say France or the UK, you can be prime minister or you can be president forever, but it doesn't happen. The people won't allow it because it's a different view. And same thing in the Scandinavian countries and so on. Too much power for one person is not a good thing. My opinion, humble opinion, but whatever. That's all I can say. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation. Is Russia ready for democracy?
It's a good question. Who makes that decision? Well, who makes that decision? You know, who says, and now you are ready for democracy? How do you learn to swim? Well, they throw you in the water. And either you drown or you swim. And most people learn how to swim, you know? It's a process. But who is, you know, I always say, people, oh, you know, Russians aren't yet ready. Really? Okay, so who's the wise person who's going to say, now they are? That's a typical, you know, it's a cop-out. It's a way of explaining why we don't have democracy. Well, people aren't ready for it. You are, of course, but you're special, right? Everyone else isn't. I don't accept that at all. Everyone's ready. That is to say, offer it and see what happens. There are certain, I think, cultures and religions that are not democratic. And so that's fine. It's their way of living. And I think that's legitimate. But there are certain things that I think are universal. There's something called human rights. And what Thomas Jefferson wrote about people having inalienable rights, among which the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is true for everyone. And I underline the word pursuit of happiness, because Jefferson didn't say the right to happiness, which is very important. He said we all have the right to pursue happiness. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. But the right to life and liberty, you can't take that away from us. And I think whether you're Chinese or whether you're in Africa somewhere in the Congo, that applies. And that's part of, or the right to vote, the right to participate. I tell you, it doesn't matter what your culture is. Did you ask a question before?
Not yet.
Oh, then go right ahead.
So, reading about polling in Russia about whether people here would actually want to return to sort of the Soviet Union model. Do you think today, if there was a referendum,
If there was an eye-ear doctor,
sort of, you know, that said, here's the dream
Right,
of
right,
equality,
right,
safety.
Yes.
Would people
Yes,
vote
yes.
to reinstate that?
you would get a certain percentage, that is to say the percentage that regularly votes for the Communist Party, which is a legal party here and it's represented in Parliament, and they usually get about, from, depending on where and how, from 7 to 12% of the vote. And that's what they get. That's what they get. The vast majority, look, Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, okay? And that's a while. There are a lot of people who have no idea what it was about. And those who were born in 1985 don't know what it was about. So you have a huge number of people who've been told by their grandparents what a wonderful thing it was. Well, that's not going to make them vote. These are people who are dissatisfied with the present situation, with the poverty, especially with that, you know, the fact that the lack of equality, the fact that nobody trusts the courts, nobody trusts the police, well, not nobody, I'm exaggerating here, but the police, the corruption, huge corruption, all of that, and people will say, well, in the Soviet Union, that wasn't the case, you know. So yeah, you get your, I'd say 12, maximum 15%. Because, I repeat, if the Communist Party were banned, I would be at a loss. But there it is, it's out there, and they're very active. And, they get 15% isn't bad, but certainly not going to bring back anything. All right, we have another, I don't want to bore you, maybe you've had enough. No?
My question to you is, what happens after Putin? What do you think the options are? I know there was some conversation that the West of the U.S. in particular is sort of propping up Khodorkovsky and making a case for him. Do you see him coming back? Who else is out there? I've heard the governor of Tula mentioned. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are zero, because I think it's a waste of time. Quite frankly, 2024, that's 4 years from now. Who knows what's going to happen in 4 years? I don't know what's going to happen the day after tomorrow. Very frankly, what's going to happen after Putin? I really don't know. I know that Khodorkovsky is not going to be president, because for that the Russians would have to like him, and they don't, and they really, really don't. They consider him to be a thief who stole their money and who's now living, very, very well in Switzerland. And why should he be president of Russia? And what's more, this is not a big issue, but he is Jewish, and Russia, like the United States, has never had a Jewish president. And it's not likely to happen tomorrow. So much as the United States might be hoping that someone from a very pro-Western person might replace Putin, forget about what the United States wants in that particular area. It's not going to matter. But who it's going to be and how it's going to happen, I have no idea at all. And frankly, I haven't got the time to think about that, because I can't change anything in that sense. What I can try to do is instill, what I try to do in people is that they are responsible for their country. Are you a citizen? Look, there were elections to the Duma in 2018. Of all those who potentially could vote, 48% voted. Now I speak to people, I say, 52% didn't vote. Now, just imagine that 52% all voted for one of the Democratic parties. They would be a majority in the Duma. Can you imagine how that would change the country? But you wouldn't get off your ass because you wanted to go to the country, you wanted to go to your dacha, you were lazy, or you found arguments like, well, it's not going to change anything, it doesn't make any sense to vote. So now what you have is what you deserve. There you have it, those 48%, you've got them. Be happy, don't complain. So what I try, and get people to get angry, but what I try to do is look, if you're a citizen, goddammit, you're responsible for your country. You are responsible. It's not the guy up there. You elected him. That's what I try to do. And I'm not thinking about what's going to happen after 1924. Huh? Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned that Putin doesn't like you and you don't like Putin.
That's right. But as they say in Russia, I'm not a dollar bill, you're not supposed to like me. Yes, so?
What the issues are.
What are the issues?
Well, he doesn't like me because I've criticized him publicly on my show, on many things, on some of the laws that he signed. Well, to give you one example, the law that bans Americans from adopting Russian children. That's just one, and there are many others. I've spoken out about this, and that's why he doesn't like me. And I don't like him because I think he's an autocrat. I think he's very undemocratic. I absolutely don't like his idea that kind of liberalism is dying away, and we have to be much more conservative in what we do. I don't like any of that. I don't like the fact that he's on television every day, and that every time it's, Putin, People are just going crazy on the air about the wonderful Vladimir Putin. I don't like that. I don't think anyone should like that, what's more. So that's why I don't like him and why he doesn't like me. The feeling is mutual. But I do respect him.
And why do you respect?
I respect him because he has made the world take Russia into consideration. Russia was ignored. Nobody cared. And now that's not the case. And Russia is not the power it once upon a time. It hasn't got the GDP that it had, but nonetheless, it's a country that you must take into consideration, and that is something he's done. And I think that as a politician, much as I don't agree with certain things, he's turned out to be probably the leading statesman of the world today. Probably he's number one. And, that's not a little thing. So I do respect him, even though I don't like him. But those are different things, excuse me, and me, that's Putin. Right? No. In fact, I've asked for interviews. He's refused me 3 times, but I'm going to keep going. I hopefully get him on the air. Let's see, ma'am.
Nope, I haven't asked one. Could you talk about the relevance of the extraordinary amount of military operations that Russia has done in Syria, the world opinion of that, and also the INF Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement that the U.S. has just dumped, and the impact on Russia?
Look, sadly enough, we believe what we're told. We think we're very independent. We think we make up our own minds. But where do we get our information? Well, we get it from television. We get it from the press. And the vast majority of us never even try to compare what this one said, what that one said, what the other one said. So we're fed a certain diet. And what the world thinks about what Russia did in Syria, what world? In the Russian world, they think one thing, and in the West, they think another thing, and in China, they don't think of that at all, and so on. So, again, it's that kind of a question. Have you ever thought about how many military bases the United States has in the world?
Almost 800.
Yeah. And do you know how many bases the Russians have? 2. Well, actually 8. So what are we talking about? The extraordinary amount of Russian military, blah, blah, blah. And you have 8 bases, and then you have 800 American bases all over the world. And people never even think about that. I say, well, look, just compare this. It's just obvious. I wish that we weren't in Syria. I wish that a different decision had been made. But again, if you compare, then, and then the INF, I think the scrapping of the INF treaty is really very, very dangerous. And now if it happens, they're going to scrap the even more important one on ballistic missiles. And then what do you get? I mean, I think that these treaties, incidentally, that were to a very large degree initiated by Ronald Reagan, of all people.
Who benefits?
The what?
The sanctions between the U.S. by the West towards Russia.
Yeah.
And who benefits?
Who?
Who benefits from these sanctions? Like the fossil fuel companies and...
Well, it's a very interesting question because in a way, the Russians have benefited because they've been forced to produce things that they didn't produce before, like in agriculture. There are now really, really interesting big agricultural industries in Russia that appeared because of the sanctions. Before that, Russia didn't produce this, didn't produce that. Now it does. And the farmers are saying, keep the sanctions. Keep the sanctions. For us, it's great. Of course, it does hurt because Russia can get banks aren't lending. So without getting those credits, Russia can't buy new machinery that it needs for its industries, so it's using old stuff. It hurts, certainly does. But in a very profound way, nobody benefits. Nobody benefits. And the stupidity that I was talking about, the American side doesn't seem to understand that in the long run, the sanctions play into Western, anti-Western interests. You say, see, there you go. So instead of, it's not going to break the Russian spirit. On the contrary, it fortifies it. And you'd think that, you know, these are intelligent politicians. You'd think that they understand this. They don't. And of course, in a way, they help Putin, because Putin is seen as the standard bearer, the man who stands up to this huge, monstrous United States. You know, here he is, our hero. Yuck. All right, we've got 5 minutes. Well, afraid perhaps is not the right word. There's competition in the world, right? There's competition. And sure, you're always wary of the competition, but that's normal if you're living, excuse me for saying this, in a capitalist world. That's what, you know, capitalism is about. It's about competition. Well, if you can't beat the competition, that's just too bad. You know, you're supposed to be able to. I don't think, it's not fear, but it's, you know, would it be good if we had no competition? Well, the initial answer is yes, but in reality the answer is no, because if you have no competition, you're not going to improve. You're just going to sit on your laurels, and that's not good. So essentially, I'm for competition, not cutthroat, but you always want to have that. All right, 2 more questions and we're finished. Sir.
Right, so when I covered Russia last year with the CCI group, and got to speak with many people, and some of them indicated that a lot of Russians want to return to its own, want Russia to go back to its old roots.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, if that is true, if Russians really do have that longing to have another czar, how much of the population do you think has that longing?
Well, the picture of the czar is this benign, fatherly figure, like the Queen of England, you know, who really has no power, but is a symbol of the country and cares for the country. And that's something that not a few Russians would like to have. But it's not like the czar who once upon a time had the supreme power to do whatever he wanted. Nobody really wants that. But this symbol of the father of Russia, as it were, or the Queen Mother, as they used to call her, you know, that, yes, I guess that they're not, I don't think a majority would, but again, there's, you know, we're so split into different groups with passionately different views that people would like to have some kind of figure up there who will represent us all. There's a sense of where we're all together because we have this figure. It's a very emotional kind of thing. It's not a political one. Well, hold on a minute. You had a question. You didn't, over there by the window.
Yes, Mr. Pozner. One of my questions that I would love to have answered by you is, who's someone that you look up to? Who's been a role model in your life, someone that either living or deceased has impacted you in your childhood, and perhaps they have affected you in some way in your current actions now?
I think we all have role models, and I certainly had more than one. But one played a special role in my life, and I guess this will be my last answer. You know, as I told you at the beginning of our meeting, my father was an immigrant. He left Russia when he was 14, and he wound up in Paris, and there he met many more Russians like him. And he had 2 friends, and they were in their early 20s, and they shared a bachelor apartment in Paris. And one's name was Vladimir Barash, and the other's name was Joseph Gordon, and there was my father, Vladimir Pozner, like myself. And Vladimir Barash ended up in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. And Joseph Gordon returned to the Soviet Union in 1936. Now, if you know anything about Soviet history, it's not a good time to return. And he was arrested in 1937 as a British spy, although he came from France, and sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag, of which he spent 17. And then in 1954, after Stalin's death and rehabilitation began, he was rehabilitated. My father lost track of him completely, of course. Came back to Moscow, and my father bumped into him. And my father and mother were going off to Germany to work, and Joseph and his wife had no place to live. And so my father said, why don't you live in our apartment? You'll watch out for the kid, and you'll have a place to live. So they did, they moved in. And he became to me like a second father. He called me Henry. And when I asked him, why are you calling me Henry, for God's sake? He said, well, you see, when I was living in France, I came across a textbook, Russian language for French people. And in that textbook, there's the following exchange between two men. One asks the other, oh, how are you? And the other says, thank you, Henry, I'm fine. And all my life, he said, I've been hoping that some Henry would ask me how I feel, so that I could say, Henry, I'm fine, but since I didn't find any, you're going to be Henry. So anyway, he was a most wonderful man. I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful he was. Passed away. One day he said to me, and I was a student, Moscow University, he said to me, you know, if I were to wish you anything, I want to wish you one thing. That you never get up in the morning, go to the bathroom to brush your teeth, see your reflection in the mirror, and want to spit at it. I wish that never happens to you. And that stayed with me for my entire life. I've always thought of that. Always. It's such a powerful, and so in a way that was my role model. There have been others. Well, thank you very much.